You know that we've been doing this topic on how Jesus changed the world. So this is a very valuable topic because the world today doesn't really think too highly of Christians and Christianity, right? We are the bigots. We are the ones who are oppressing people. We are the ones who are interfering with the progress of society, and everything would be really great if it wasn't for us Christians. Now, you see this kind of in the undertones of mass media. If you look at the kinds of talks that are being given at universities, you see things like, how can we undo the Christian hegemony, right? Which is a fancy word for all-encompassing dictatorship, right? That if it wasn't for that Christian hegemony, right, we could solve race relations, right? We could solve all kinds of societal problems if we could just throw off the bondage of Christianity. So when we're witnessing, when we're trying to reach people for Christ, they don't want to listen to you, right? You're part of the past. You're regressive. Everybody is interested in progress and making things better in the world. So the last thing they want to do is help somebody like you who is so stuck in the past and regressive that we just can't make things better in the world. You're part of the problem. Well, that's not really true. Christianity is the greatest force for good that the world has ever seen. But we are forgetting that. Even Christians begin to wonder and doubt because they're not reminded of all the good that has happened over the past 2,000 years. So that's part of what we're going to be doing today. So we started off by talking about how Jesus did that, how he did it through his disciples and through his followers over the past 2,000 years, through transformed lives. And that's the real key, through transformed lives. But we also want to talk about specifically how, or in what way, how is it that the world was changed? What has changed? What was the world like? And how is it different now? Because those are the things that you can talk to your friends and neighbors about, your family members about, when they challenge you and when they say, why are you part of this system that is oppressing people? You can talk to them about specifically how the world has changed, because a lot of the way that the world has changed has been so ingrained and incorporated in people's lives nowadays that they don't realize that the world used to think very differently not so long ago. So Kevin talked last week about the change in the condition of women, right? The freedom and the dignity that women now have because of the teachings of Jesus. Any questions about that? Any questions about that topic that Kevin spoke about last week? Okay, that was a great message. This week we're going to be talking about another area that was changed because of Jesus and because of his teachings, and that is about the sanctity of human life. So, I'm sure if I asked you, in general, you would say that the world before Jesus had a very low regard for human life. I think you probably agree with me on that. What we're going to be looking at today is exactly how low it was and what has changed. Because the world had a low regard for human life, but sometimes we don't realize just how bad it was. And without the teachings of Jesus, theoretically, even though for many non-Christians they have incorporated this view, this high view of human life, without that underground foundation and teaching of Jesus, it could go away. The value of human life can decrease until it becomes almost worthless as it was in the ancient world. When Jews and Christians came onto the scene and began to influence things, things began to change because they had a different view of human life. Right? They believed that human beings were the culmination of a creation process. They were God's crowning joy. That they were products of the God who made the universe. So they had value. And not only just products, not like another type of animal or a pet of his, but actually beings that were made in his image. So in some way, we reflect God's glory much more than the rest of creation. So we are a special creation from God. They also believed that God honored human life by taking on a body. Right? The human being was so important and so honored by this fact that God visited us. Right? He didn't just appear as a spiritual entity or a face in the sky and taught, right? Which he could have done. He took on a human body. He became one of us. Do you see how that elevates the status of human beings? That God would deign to put on flesh? Flesh is honored by that. Right? It's an amazing thing that God would humble himself to do that. So the human body becomes now a very special thing. In the ancient world, there were a lot of religious teachings out there. You read in Scripture about the Gnostics, right? They're very briefly mentioned throughout the New Testament. But one of the main teachings of the Gnosticism was that the flesh is evil. Right? The physical world is bad. It's only the spiritual world that's good. So this led even some Christians to believe in the idea that God was not going to raise people from the dead. That's the whole argument in 1 Corinthians, right? So Paul is teaching, no, that's not true. We are going to rise from the dead. But the reason they thought, or probably the reason they thought that there wasn't going to be a resurrection of the dead is because they had this very low view of the human body, right? The human body is corrupted by evil. That makes humanity and human beings and the flesh an evil thing. Well, it's true we are corrupted, but there's a bigger plan that Christians knew about that countered this idea of Gnosticism, that human beings are valuable, that our flesh is important. Though it may be tainted by sin, it can be redeemed. And that we will be raised because our bodies are important. And we will be given even better bodies in the future. Supernatural bodies instead of just natural bodies, but supernatural bodies. So Christians had an elevated value of the body and human life. This meant that they opposed the practices and the culture of the ancient world. So they opposed infanticide, they opposed exposure, they opposed abortion, gladiatorial games, human sacrifices, and suicide. So that's what we'll be talking about. Does anybody know what exposure is? What's exposure?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
What is it?
Nakedness, like
Nope. Nope. It's not. Yeah. It means to uncover, right. But how is it applied to the value of human life? All right, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Topic is infanticide. Killing newborns was an accepted practice. Right? When I remember growing up, if you had a cat that had a litter, there was not a lot of spaying and things going on, right, in those days. Maybe I was a little too long ago. But people really did just take the little kittens and put them in a bucket of water. You know, it sounds cruel, but that's what was done. Now we're big into spaying and getting animals spayed so that doesn't happen. But that used to happen all the time with human beings. If you had a baby and you didn't want it, you just put it head down into a bucket of water. Yeah, that was accepted. That was normal. That was tolerated. No one even objected to it. And it wasn't just, you think, okay, well, maybe it was deformed babies, right? That's what they did. They did deformed babies, right? Or ones who were weak, sickly, you know, the runt of the litter. Maybe that's what they did. No, it wasn't just that. Yes, they did do that. Of course they did. Yeah. Deformed, oh. Missing a hand, okay, into the bucket, right? Don't look very healthy, look kind of sickly, into the bucket, face down, right? But also ones they didn't want, right? So much so that in recorded history we know that large families were actually rare. Large families were rare. And there are some times where we have recordings of censuses, right? Where people's families were written down. So we do have some evidence from genealogical records and from historical records that large families were actually rare. One interesting thing is that in a certain census taken in the Roman Empire, less than 1% of the families had more than one female child. Because, of course, that was another thing that was no good when you have a baby. Oh, it's a female. Darn. Into the bucket. So, and it wasn't just the Romans, although they were pretty bad about it, let's put it that way. Greeks also, Polybius, a historian, blamed the population decline in ancient Greek on this practice of just killing off babies when they were born. It was also common in India, China, Japan, Africa, North and South American Indians, Eskimos. Sometimes we have this, the modern world tries to say how wonderful things were in our untouched paradise of North America and South America before the Europeans came. Really, if you look at the life they lived, not very good. Constant warfare, brutal oppression of women, slavery, and this practice of just killing babies, right? I have a note here about a letter from a Roman soldier, and I should have probably printed it out so I could read it to you. We have an actual historical record of a Roman who left his family and went to North Africa on a campaign. And he wrote back to his wife about details, some instructions for her for running the farm and taking care of business while he was gone. And in the midst of this discussion about what she was to do, he said, "I know that you are about due to deliver. If it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, throw it away." And then he went on to discuss other issues with the farm. Yeah, Don.
Can you give us a date or a time that these things were, have we passed a point in 1800? Have we passed that point in time before our lifetime?
Yes. So it was outlawed by Christians in 374. 374, the Christian emperor, I'll have to look at the name in my notes, outlawed infanticide. So, but prior to that, we don't know of any historical laws. In fact, there were laws where you were required to do this. Those are the kinds of laws about infanticide in the past of human history. Sparta, as an example, the nation of Sparta, city-state of Sparta, you had to, when a baby was born, it was law, you had to bring the baby before the city elders. And they would tell you whether you were to kill the child or not. Right? And that was just normal life. Christians called it murder. Right? They were the first to call it murder. They remembered Jesus' teachings about little children. Right? Matthew 19:14. Bring the little children unto me. Don't stop them. They're valuable. Little children are valuable to God. So Jesus had a high regard for children. The early church fathers condemned the practice. Somebody look up Romans 12:2. Romans 12:2. And read it out loud, real loud.
Did you practice infanticide?
They did not. So Jews had a high regard for human life. Not perfect. We do have, and later when you see, they did make some mistakes. But remember, there was, the Psalms talked very highly about having children, and children being a blessing from God. So they were much better than the rest of the nations. Romans 12:2. I should have just printed it out. Yeah, go ahead, real loud.
And be not conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Yeah.
For your proving what is the will of God, good and acceptable and perfect.
Right. So again, it was through transformed lives. They made a difference because their lives were transformed. And I mentioned already about it. So it was Emperor Valentinian. He was the guy, he was a Christian emperor, and he outlawed infanticide. That was widely practiced is exposure. And exposure is very similar to infanticide, except that instead of, strangling your newborn child, you just took it out into the woods, laid it down under a tree, and walked away. So apparently there were people who felt guilty enough that they couldn't actually wring the life out of their own baby, so they would just allow it to die. And that's called exposure. It's child abandonment. Just expose it to the elements. So this was a very common practice. So it was babies or small children, right? Could be 2 years old, can't get along on his own, into the river. Just toss him in the river. Leave him out in the woods. Get rid of him. In fact, it was so common that Roman literature is actually full of the occasional examples of when people survived this, right? So sometimes you throw away a 5-year-old, and instead of getting eaten by the wolves, he gets raised by the wolves. So this is where the story of Romulus and Remus, right? The founding of Rome is based on the story of two brothers who supposedly were abandoned, tossed into the Tiger River, and is it the Tigris? I think it's the Tigris River, but survived, raised by animals, and founded the city of Rome. Another, remember the story of Oedipus Rex, right? The famous play. He winds up marrying his mother. How does he do that? Because he was thrown away as a child. But somebody found him and raised him. So people speculate that maybe this was put into literature to try to kind of soothe the consciences of the people who were doing this, right? You don't have to feel so bad about leaving your baby in the forest because maybe they actually survived and became somebody famous, right? Possible. So they were commonly thrown into rivers, on manure piles, by the roadside, just left for prey, for birds to eat, or for animals to come and devour, which they did. And I mentioned about Sparta. There is no guilt recorded. We have no historical records of any person writing how they felt guilty about this, or that they thought that other people ought not to do this. There's nothing. This was common practice, totally normal. A woman would take her baby or her toddler out into the woods and just leave him there. So this is around 300 BC. I have to look that up. And he talks about surgical abortions that were done. What they had was they had a hook-shaped instrument that the inner edge of the hook was sharpened to a razor blade sharpness, right? And it was on the inside of the hook to protect the outside. And that was used, literally pushed into the womb and then used to hook and cut the fetus into pieces so it could be pulled out. So they had surgical abortions back before the time of Jesus. And it was a common practice. So some historians have speculated as to why it became so common. There was a time period when marriage was very disparaged in the Roman Empire. And in fact, Julius Caesar had to enact laws forcing people to marry because their society literally was crumbling. People were not getting married. They disparaged marriage. I hate to say, it sounds like today, right? Marriage is very disparaged. People are not getting married. They don't want to get married. They think very poorly of it. And during the Roman Empire, this was happening too. People were thinking that marriage is just a burden. There's no reason to do it. And this really caused a lot of abortions and infanticide. They also liked the idea of being childless. They wanted to be childless. So there were financial advantages to being childless. So Julius Caesar had to enact marriage laws where he made it that if you wanted to inherit money from your parents, you couldn't do it unless you were married. He had to literally incentivize people to get married because the population was declining and society was literally falling apart. So there was this culture of killing. There was this low regard for human life that pervaded the Greek and Roman Empire and other parts of the world. And they had as examples for them the Roman Empire, the emperors, right? Many of them were brutal. They just took human life for any reason, right? It was a very dangerous thing to serve an emperor because they would just kill you if they didn't like what you did. And this was a very pervasive thing. Murder really wasn't murder unless you killed somebody that somebody else liked, right? Or you killed somebody who was important. Then it became murder. But if you killed somebody who was unimportant, or one of your servants, or even your own wife, you had the right to do that. That was not considered murder. There's this other historical detail. Sorry for the gruesomeness of this, but aborted babies were actually used for cosmetic purposes. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know if you know that, but that's coming back today, right? Some of the stem cell research that's being done is to grow tissue for cosmetics, for potions, healing salves and balms and things because they have stem cells in them. Where do you think they get those stem cells from? Okay, this also was outlawed in 374. Now, before we get into how Christians reacted, I have run into this question. Sometimes I've been asked, the Bible doesn't really say anything against abortion, right? I mean, not by well-meaning Christians, by Christians who oppose abortion, but yet they'll say, where in the Bible does it really say? Where does it really say? Yeah.
In the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill.
Right? But doesn't that bring up the issue of what does it mean to kill? Who is a human being? Why doesn't the Bible say that it's wrong to kill before the baby's born? Right? That's a real question, but I think we're going to answer something that is little known about the Greek language that we'll be able to.
Let's go back to the garden, the devil, and the power of suggesting, well, did God really say
Right,
that?
right. Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of ways that we fool ourselves into thinking that sin is okay.
We battle not of flesh and bone, but of principalities.
Right? It's spiritual warfare. So I think we'll be able to help you with this. Okay. Let's see, how are we doing for time? I'd better skip this verse, but write down Galatians 5:20. Write down Galatians 5:20. So there's a verse that has a Greek word pharmakia in it. You've probably heard this, right? And so we know that this refers to, some translations have it sorcery, some translations have it witchcraft, right? It's only mentioned twice in the New Testament. Okay? But the interesting thing is how this word is used outside the New Testament in the Greek language of the time, in the koinonia. It's used many times. So now we know exactly what they meant by pharmakia. Pharmakia, from which we get the name pharmacy, is the making or taking of potions. The making or taking of potions, right? That's where we get pharmacy from. What's it got to do with witchcraft? Well, because witches and sorcerers tended to be the people you would go to if you needed a potion. You would go to the town witch who knew how to make the potion for what you needed. Guess what the most common potion people needed was for chemical abortions. The witches of the town knew which plants, which extracts to mix together, and if you drank it, you would have an abortion. So that is what this verse is talking about. We know it has to do with drugs, so we sometimes think that this has to do with magic, or it has to do with taking drugs, right? But from the use we have in Greece, in the Greek language, we know this is actually referring to abortions. So it does specifically, the Bible does specifically outlaw, condemn abortions. Also in the early church fathers' writing, in the Didache, which is a early manual from the 1st century. This is an early manual for Christian churches and for Christians on how to behave, how to do things like do baptisms, how to do communion. The Didache very adamantly denounces abortion. So it was recognized as murder all the way up until modern times, right? Even the early feminists of last century, they were pro-life. They recognized abortion as an evil put upon women, forced upon them by their male counterparts, right? This is how men got rid of the evidence that they were sleeping around, by getting their lovers to have abortions. And the feminists of the day were opposed to it, right? Now, you can talk to students at the local college. They believe that abortion, the feminists tell them that abortion was normal in history, and it was only until around the 1920s that the crazy Christians started trying to outlaw it. But fortunately, in the 1970s, they got it right. The Supreme Court got it right. That's what people today believe. So we do need to get the history right. Here's a quote from a historian, Ferdinand Schenck. The intrinsic worth of each individual man and woman as a child of God and an immortal soul was introduced by Christianity. And that is historically true. That's really true. All right, we've got only about 5 minutes left, so let's get into the gladiatorial games because few people know the real story of this. Gladiatorial games started in Rome in 264 BC. So by the time of Christ, they had been doing this for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. Slaves, criminals, POWs would fight each other, or they would fight wild beasts, just for entertainment. And they would fight to the death. Right? This was not, boxing, wrestling, kickboxing. It was not that. It was swords, and they used to change it up just to make it interesting, right? Spears, nets, fire, anything to titillate, anything to entertain the masses who loved this stuff. You think it's bad. You go to a hockey game, and as soon as somebody slams into somebody, the crowd yells, "Hit him! Hit him!" Right? Have you heard that? That mass insanity? Just like that. Only, kill him! Cut his throat! Rip his guts out! And they literally meant it. That was the crowd. So these events would last for weeks. They were not on a regular schedule. It was whenever the emperor decided that he wanted to hold one, right? Maybe he's got bad polls came out. Let's have some gladiatorial games. And they would last for weeks, sometimes even months. Right? As many as 100 gladiators per day. So these events would go on all day long. So that means that at least 50 people are being killed every day in front of people to a live audience. And some of the people who survived would die later of their wounds. So you probably had 60 or 70% mortality rate from these gladiatorial games. On one occasion, at least 5,000 gladiators and 10,000 wild animals were killed during a game series. Right? That was a game that went on for several months. People just loved it, could not get enough. Here's a quote from the book that we're using as a framework for this discussion, How Christianity Changed the World, by Alvin Schmidt. The barbaric cruelty, the agonizing screams of the victims, and the flow of human blood stirred no conscience in the crowds of the gladiatorial games. In fact, we have testimony from Christians who were tempted to go to the games. They write about how addictive it was, about the adrenaline rush that you would get when you saw a tiger eating the throat out of a gladiator, right? It was exhilarating, right? And they were tempted by that, and they confessed this kind of thing. And so we have written records of this. The Christians condemned the games, they boycotted the games, right? Political action, dare I say. They would not permit their brothers and sisters to go to these games. The church fathers criticized the games ruthlessly in their writings. Today, right, we've gotten to the point where it seems inconceivable, right? We cannot think that human beings would do this kind of thing to each other. But it literally was the case. It was normal. People not only allowed it, they loved it. They loved it. And again, it was ended by Christian emperors. Human sacrifices was another issue that is well known and worldwide. The Irish, Prussians, Lithuanians, the Mayans and Aztecs did this. Aztecs, even after you were sacrificed to their god, they would eat you as a sign of dominance over you. So cannibalism was the case. And suicide also was outlawed by Christians when they came into political power. And again, we're seeing these views of the sanctity of life being degraded. But we can make a difference. There's still time, right? Just like Anthony said this morning.